Beautiful. So welcome again, Denis Rancourt. I'm excited to have you today. I'm Tania the Herbalist for anyone who might not already know, and I'm privileged to interview yet again this research scientist who's very well versed into researching science, so much so that he actually teaches the graduate levels on how to properly read scientific data. So I definitely think you know a thing or two for sure.
Yeah. I'm no longer a professor. I'm now a researcher with the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. But you're right. For decades, I developed and taught graduate courses in measurement science to many students in many faculties and so on. I did all kinds of things like that. But right now, I'm a member scientist of PANDA, which is an international organization of scientists, and I'm a researcher with the Ontario Civil Liberties Association.
Beautiful. So I think you're very, very credible to not only talk on scientific data, because I'm sure you hear it sometimes often, well, you're a professor of physics, so how do you necessarily know about biology and chemistry? But based on your, your resume, you're definitely well-versed in really all aspects, including environmental, like you had talked about. So I think you've got a lot of credibility, and it's a privilege to have people hear the knowledge that you have to bring.
Thanks, Tania, and thanks for inviting me. And I understand we might be doing some regular clips in the future, just you and I, on short little things to catalyze thought and new ideas and things. And I'm really happy about that. And today you've got some questions about my latest paper, but we're also going to concentrate on vaccines. That's the plan for today, right?
A wonderful topic, especially with how quickly that's expediting. So yes, I do look forward to doing, like you said, little clips moving in the future on really a number of different topics. I think there's a lot that we can cover and a lot that's going to stimulate people's thought processes and want to ask some very, very valid questions.
Now, Tania, I want to say something. You introduced me as being credible and having a science background and so on. And I want to say something about that. I think we have to distinguish relative knowledge. Like, compared to the average scientist, I'm very knowledgeable. I'm interdisciplinary. I have worked on things at a deep level, all the way down to the quantum mechanics of molecules and all the way up to the biogeochemistry in the environment. I ran an internationally recognized research lab for a couple of decades. It was well funded. I've had, dozens and dozens of graduate students and who became themselves professors and so on. So compared to the average scientist, I'm very knowledgeable, but that's a relative knowledge. It's relative to that group, okay? In absolute terms, how much do we know about nature, really? How much do we know about how a vaccine can operate in your body and so on, and how a cell works and how molecular interactions within the cytoplasm work and all that stuff? In an absolute sense, I am very ignorant. And as are all scientists, this is something we have to realize, is that scientists do not know very much at all compared to what there would be to know and to understand about what's really going on. So there's relative knowledge and there's absolute knowledge. So you can be high in one and still be very low in the other. And that's generally the case for the people who are high in one. So that's one thing, but it also works in terms of science itself. When you look at risk attenuation evaluations, these studies that try to show that vaccines are effective, for example, or that masks work and so on, they will always be reporting a relative risk attenuation, which, if the absolute effect of the treatment, whether it's to wear a mask or to be vaccinated, if the absolute effect in real terms is small, the relative advantage is meaningless, okay? And it has a large error associated with it. It can go all the way from positive to negative. This is what people have to understand, is that scientists are part of, generally speaking, are part of the propaganda machine. And they're used and manipulated, and they're willingly manipulated often to be part of this propaganda machine. So they'll report on relative risk attenuation when they shouldn't be, when they should be insisting that the absolute effect that you can measure is not detectable, for example, okay? And so on. So this notion of relative and absolute is very important in thinking about things and in thinking about what's being reported, right?
I agree. And I think what's
Yeah.
important is as a scientist, it's really just asking the questions. You're right. It's not like everybody knows everything, but the fact that you ask the questions and you try to dissect and find the data behind it is what I believe makes you very, very credible. It's just about asking the questions and admitting if you don't know something about everything, right?
Right. Well, to a very good first approximation, all the scientists basically know nothing. Okay. I mean, that's a good first approximation. Okay. Now they have developed a vocabulary, they've developed a way of thinking about things, they've established some basic facts, and they've taken out and discredited some theories and things like that. And they're puddling around doing that kind of thing. But before them is this incredible complexity of real life, which they do not have a grasp of completely. They're completely limited by their training, their perspective, and in addition to that, they are constrained by the people who fund them and who manipulate them to only look at a micro question at a time and to never step out of their micro expertise. For example, they'll be asked, is this particular vaccine safe in the sense that in a trial, will it induce very violent reactions? Okay. So they will only answer that question in their particular trial. And but is it efficient? Do we know the long-term effects? Do we know the midterm effects? Do we know if whatever is happening in the body can be transferred from generation to generation in people? All these things they don't know, and they won't be speaking to it. And then the propagandists will pick up what they said and they say, see, it's safe.
You're
Okay,
right. That's
because you
and
didn't
that
induce deaths in your trial subjects. Okay, so it's safe. So therefore, vaccines are safe. And if you say the opposite, you're anti-science. I mean, that's the level of crazy that we're at here. Okay.
And that's exactly what you're seeing more and more now, right? They say to trust the science, but they don't recognize that the science is actually primarily most of the time funded and pushed, which is very low grade science when you actually really dissect it, right? Like you're saying, in fact, it goes against much of our evolution and biological studies that you actually even talk about in your newest article. The measures do not prevent deaths. Transmission is not by contacts. Masks provide no benefit, and vaccines are inherently dangerous. You talk about that exactly, and you mentioned an article that a part of an article that I loved, and I'm going to actually look up and reading it myself, but the one by Rutherford and Gandhi, how it was titled Perspective in October of 2020, stating this is a perfect example of the science stating the efficacy of masks. So if you don't mind just talking a little bit into that before we get into the vaccines on how this really actually ties into the decades of scientific studies that you've actually seen, because I noticed they always use particular words, for example, the title of perspective, but then they'll say more evidence is accruing to support the idea, not the fact. It's really an idea, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of manipulation, and science is participating directly in the propaganda with these, scientists writing op-eds in scientific journals, giving their perspectives and their opinions and their and you can see in the words, it's just oozing with bias and a very limited view of things. It's really disturbing. And this phrase that I thought I would only see politicians and public health officials use, which is this accruing amount of evidence, but there's increasing evidence. No, there isn't. Look at the policy grade randomized controlled trials with verified outcome, the only thing you can look at if you want to avoid bias. And, there are not more of them that are contradicting what the last 15 of them have said. Okay, so there is not increasing evidence to support your crazy idea that masks work. Listen, there have been 15 randomized controlled trials with verified outcomes that cannot detect a benefit in terms of reducing transmission of viral respiratory diseases by wearing a mask. And it's been done recently in the general population as well. What more do you need? That is science. That is what the science is telling us. Masks do not work. Why are you continuing to blah blah about this? That is the science that should be informing policy. It is hard science. We're talking 15 selected, multiply reviewed, meta-analyzed, individual, high quality, large, randomized control trials that show that you cannot, by these measurements, detect a benefit from wearing a mask in terms of reducing this risk. What the hell more do you need? Do you need,
Yeah,
like that is just so annoying
that's right.
to see this,
And the best part is just on the topic of masks, you had also talked about how the World Health Organization, which is obviously the organization that everyone is, treating like the Holy Grail to know everything about it. They've actually even buried some of their studies from the past since COVID to go along with the public health. And then now selling the masks as a one-way solution. So it prevents transmission from the wearer, but doesn't actually protect the wearer.
Yeah,
So
I write about that, the covering up and the hiding of articles on the World Health Organization website. I give a good example of that, and also this complete fantasy of the magical one-way mask. I talk about that in my article. This idea that you could put a piece of cloth on your face and it will not prevent aerosol particles that are laden with from coming into your lungs, but then when you breathe out, it will stop them, so that you're doing so-called source control. Okay, it's completely against the physical principle of how aerosol particles carried by the fluid air that go around the mask and go through the big pores in the cloth mask and so on, how that works. I mean, the same route of input is the same basically as output, except that the mask moves a bit when you're breathing out and all this kind of stuff. But basically, there's no such thing as a freaking one-way mask. Okay,
right.
there's no measurement that shows that, except if you're talking about coughing large droplets out. It's like if you put something in front of your face when you cough, you'll stop the large droplets. That's irrelevant. The transmission mechanism is aerosol particles. That's why this phenomenon is seasonal. Aerosol particles are stable in dry air in the winter in mid-latitude countries. All of the science, decades of science, tells us that these seasonal viral respiratory diseases are transmitted by aerosol particles. That's why it's not person-to-person contact. That's why there are super events of transmission. That's why everything makes sense if you just admit what is now the obvious, given all the research that's been done, which is that the main and dominant transmission mechanism is through aerosol particles. That's also why masks do not work, and that there cannot be a one-way mask, okay? And besides, large droplets, so what if you can stop them? Even if you don't stop them, the fact that they're large, they fall immediately to the ground. They're not going to fly up into someone's eyes unless you're purposefully coughing into their faces, this is there's just so much nonsense. And trained scientists are repeating this nonsense, about the one way, about source control, as if that was a thing that is plausible. So yeah, that's the kind of crazy world that we're in right now.
Right. And the one-way masks, it's funny because I want to tie it into obviously the vaccines, but to kind of bridge it into that, I want to shed light on the PCR test, because obviously we know the isolation of the virus has not yet actually happened, right? So I usually ask the question is, how are you creating a vaccine for something if it has not been isolated? Better yet, how they're creating it, the type of vaccine that they're creating. But on the topic of PCR tests, you also in your article talked about how, which many people have now come to see, there's international scientists that actually talk about how the PCR test doesn't actually pick up the whole virus, but just viral fragments, right? The genetic
A
material.
specific viral fragment that they decided they wanted to detect, okay, that you cannot prove is from the actual pathogen that has been purified, isolated, certified, so you can send it out, reproduce it, send it out to labs to develop detection methods and to develop vaccines and protocols and so on. They've never done that. So it's a crazy story, and I'm going to tell it. But
Please.
that's right. The PCR test is a lot of garbage, because it by design, it cannot discern an active infection in the person's body, that the person's actually infectious. All it detects is a piece of genetic code that is believed to be from this pathogen that was selected supposedly to indicate the presence of that pathogen, but that piece can be on a piece of a large molecule after the virus has been destroyed. So there is no, in the measurement itself, it cannot discern when you're actually infected. It could be months, and they've measured this months later. It could be months after you've completely defeated the infection, recovered, your immune system can handle it, you're in perfect health, and you still have these remnants that the PCR test will detect, okay? So there have been, and I review that in my article, there have been now really good studies that characterize this PCR test. There's also a vicious criticism that's well merited that shows that the original PCR article that proposed this test has, you know, authors with conflict of interest out the gazoo, and the methods and assumptions are wrong, and you name it, right? The PCR test should be made illegal. It is an instrument to cause harm in society. It is an instrument that was fabricated in terms of the net effect. It was fabricated for the purposes of propaganda to make a testing pandemic where there isn't actually a pandemic in terms of people going into hospitals and in terms of clinically verified infections and so on, okay, after it's over. And the other thing is, these diseases are always seasonal. There is going to be a rise of a viral respiratory disease, clinically seen symptoms every winter, okay? So you throw that into the mix, and then you have these stupid PCR tests and so on. So yeah, no, it's just so crazy. But I succinctly and I think very clearly review the most recent and authoritative science that undoes all of that in my recent article that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the
It was
PCR
such a
test,
great article.
no, the
Yeah.
PCR test is just so obscene. It's so obscene that you could use that. There's
And
two parameters there. One is the number of amplification cycles, the so-called CT, okay? As you get above 30, you start getting into false positives in a significant way. And they're going all the way to 40 and beyond, okay? So that's one thing that's been demonstrated. The other thing is how long after your symptoms have started, okay? If you look at the time, anything after 10 days, it's been proven, everything you detect by this PCR test is nonsense in the sense that it does not represent a viable virus that can be reproduced in a cell culture that is designed to be able to reproduce viruses, okay, of this type. So anything, and when they do these darn PCR tests on the general population, they do not determine when or if you were infected, or if you have symptoms or light symptoms, or when they just measure everybody. So you could have had this thing 2 months ago, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, mild symptoms you didn't notice. You still have remnants of that thing they're going to detect with this ramped up PCR. It's all meaningless, okay? And this has been proven in high quality scientific articles that I outline and explain in my article.
I like that you talk about that, because once again, people are always saying trust the science, but like you had said, the PCR test studies that the mainstream media and public health is pushing is ones that are actually created by people of conflict of interest. So there's actually bias in that study, and it's not the science that you're talking about.
They never should have allowed public health agencies and labs to report results of that test without specifying what the value of CT was that you had to go to before you detected something, and without specifying the particular person, when did they have symptoms? Can you establish that they've never had symptoms before, that they were not previously exposed, and therefore you're detecting just the garbage that results from that, okay? If you don't look into and report that, then the test, the so-called PCR test, has no clinical value and no epidemiological value, okay? It has no value for science, for reporting to the public, or for clinical evaluation if you don't do that, okay? So it's just garbage, total garbage. And the scientists that are saying that and that are willing to say it and that are experts are being, excluded from the media. They're not being interviewed. They're not being allowed to have their say on YouTube, et cetera, et cetera. It's shameful. No, we're in an age of extreme ignorance where the media and the system is preventing people from hearing independent thinking experts and their arguments and so on. This is an age of extreme ignorance. We're just being manipulated, pure and simple.
They're not allowing that flow of conversation, the two-way narrative. It's one narrative or it's classified as misinformation, which is obviously not misinformation.
Yep. And the scientists will be discredited. They will be deplatformed. They will be put off into secondary sources, and they will never be interviewed by the mainstream media. They will never be shown to have this opposing view. So, the end result is, what's the point of science? If it can only support the propaganda that you want to put forward, how is it science? What's the point of that?
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I like the convo with the PCR, because I have to tie it into the vaccines now, because you've now got the PCR test. Like you said, as soon as they amplify it, anything above 30, it tends to show a lot of false positives, most of which are false positives. But then they're running on that for the cases. So then you're hearing about the cases, you're not hearing about the deaths. And through this scare tactic is how they're pushing, obviously, yet another lockdown now, with even stricter measures. Obviously, we heard about curfews out in Quebec, and I wouldn't be surprised if it moves its way over to Ontario. But it's as if they have to keep the fear mongering just long enough to be able to implement the vaccine.
Yeah, well, I don't know, but psychologically, the politicians must be frightened, because if they were to end this nonsense, like China did, China just decided, no, there's nothing here. We're not doing this. Okay. And they stopped, and their economy is flourishing. And, they did what they did at the beginning, and then they said no more. And there's a brilliant, on YouTube, there's a brilliant strategist, former general of Russia, that explained how China decided to do that. But anyway, that's a side story. So where was I? Where were we going with this?
We were talking about pushing the PCR test, pushing the lockdowns, which is to continue the fear mongering, essentially, to bring in a vaccine.
See, the politicians must be frightened, because if they say, okay, now we can go back to normal, as soon as they say that people will relax, and they'll start thinking, what just happened? How many people really died? What just happened? Why did you do this? Why did I lose my business? Why did I lose my income? Why did my family member commit suicide? What the heck is going? As soon as they say, now it's all okay, we can stop doing this now, we can go back to normal, actually have a parliament, actually, people are going to be really angry. As soon as people come down from that fear, and come down from having to deal with yet another martial law type imposition, we're going to say, what the heck? We're going to be doing an accountability thing, and we're going to say, what the heck did you just do to this society? And that's going to happen more and more. So they have every advantage to continue this thing. Plus, at the moment, when they impose lockdowns, people are going along with it. People are cheering them on. There was actually a scientific study that I mentioned in my article that showed that there's a relationship between these crazy lockdown measures and the popularity of the leaders that are putting them into place. People want to be saved. And the propaganda is, we're all going to die. And the government is saying, well, all we got to do is lock down, wear a mask, etc. And don't worry, we're developing a vaccine. And people cheer them on. This is insane. Yeah.
And I did say, I think that it's definitely a psychological warfare, in a sense that if we can scare them enough and push these measures and take them to a breaking point, then they're going to beg for a solution. And that solution is what they're portraying is to be the vaccine.
Well, yeah, the people will beg for whatever solution you put in front of them, and tell them that scientists and everybody that wants their good have said that this is the solution. People will fight for it. They'll line up, kilometer-long lineups to get vaccinated and so on, right?
Right. Yeah.
But, I'm hoping that's not completely true. I'm hoping that a lot of people will reject the vaccine. A lot of health workers are rejecting the vaccine.
That's right.
There's a lot of resistance because we're talking about actually injecting things into your body. So they're really crossing a barrier there, which is the barrier of your skin. And it's one thing to do propaganda. It's one thing to get you to behave a certain way, wear a mask, show that you're part of the accepted society by wearing your nice mask and everything. That's one thing. But if you start actually injecting things into people's bodies, and some people die, and some people get very sick, and some people get paralyzed, and God knows what's going to happen when they do this to elderly people, because there have been no tests on these vaccines on that population, the fragile elderly people that have all kinds of conditions, no tests whatsoever. It should be illegal to vaccinate the elderly people with these experimental vaccines. That should be an absolute illegal thing to do. There have been no safety tests even, not just whether it'll help, but will it harm you and how much of the time and to what degree. It hasn't been done on elderly people. So
Right.
there should be a moratorium. They should not. Some nations are saying we have to vaccinate the elderly in priority. That is like the craziest. It's criminal. It's criminal thinking.
It is. And I love that you touched on that, because they're taking it to say, we never tested on them. Why? Because I'm sure in the trials it probably wouldn't have very good results, but yet we're the first ones that were going to trial it out in the real world. Same way with pregnancy in children. And now they're saying has not been tested, but we still recommend it for pregnant women.
Yeah, I haven't heard that one, but it's the same kind of criminal thinking. Oh, it's all just so crazy.
And I do want to highlight that this is not about being anti-vax or not, or this and that. What makes this COVID vaccine so unique is the way it's actually being made, right? So many of us have now come to realize that there has never been any type of mRNA vaccine. So if you can talk about that, because I do feel like even the people that are begging for lockdowns and stuff, there's a great number of people that no matter how asleep they are, they do not want this vaccine.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a long story.
We've got time.
Okay. So I want to mention, though, that we're going to be talking about safety, but the other question is efficacy of the vaccine. Does it actually do something beneficial? And Doshi, who is a scientist, editor, high-profile guy at the British Medical Journal, just put out an article on January 4th, okay? A very important article that you can all read and look at. I don't know if it's a good way to do this, to show you on the screen the article so that people can find it based on the title and so on, okay? But he spells out in here, he looks at the data that Big Pharma, Pfizer in particular, is giving to the FDA to get this emergency approval of the vaccine, right? So they have to keep providing data, and they have to talk about their trials and what they did and what the results are. It's all filtered through them. They're the ones that have a legal responsibility to give the data. We're not seeing the raw data. The scientists are not seeing the raw data. The public's not seeing the raw data. It's all through these huge filters. And Doshi is really angry about that. And basically, he wrote this article in this leading scientific journal, and he points out that, well, here this is his abstract. While some of the additional details are reassuring, some are not. Here I outline new concerns about the trustworthiness and meaningfulness of the reported efficacy results. That's a very diplomatic way of putting it. If you look lower down in the articles, he points out that they're just talking about comparing 8 people who were infected and 162 people who were infected, who they believe got COVID. Okay, comparing the placebo group to the people who received the vaccine. But he says, wait a minute, look at this data that you haven't reported. There are 3,400 total cases of people who got COVID-like symptoms, but you didn't test them, or you didn't get a positive result. And this is not to mention that the way that they're testing is this stupid PCR test. So convolute into this crazy stuff that they're giving the FDA, this idea that you're not actually testing for a vaccine, and one that is infectious and one that has been isolated that you developed a proper test for. Okay, but even if you take the results at face value, he says, we're talking about 100 cases here, and there's thousands of cases of people in both groups, placebo and so on, comparable numbers, who got these symptoms, and who he thinks it's reasonable to assume that that was COVID, or it could have been COVID, and we don't know. This is the kind of garbage they're using to demonstrate the efficacy of this stupid virus, okay? They haven't demonstrated the efficacy. They have not. And their data, more and more, as you look at it more and more, and as they disclose it a little bit by little, people like Doshi, who are careful readers, will tell you, what have they proven? Nothing. We don't know if this thing is of any benefit. Okay, that's important. So there's safety and there's benefit, and the benefit is very tenuous, and the safety hasn't really been tested thoroughly. Okay, and when you look at safety, you have to understand that there's so many things that can go wrong when you start vaccinating people. Okay, I will talk about this article momentarily. This is published in Toxicology Reports by Kostov et al. I'm going to just mention this article, okay, because in there they have a table in section 3.4. It's entitled, the section's entitled Vaccine Mechanisms with Uncertain Consequences. So they basically go through the known scientific mechanisms whereby vaccines can do very nasty things to the body, to society, to diseases that are going to develop and so on. And they have 16 mechanisms that have been proven and written about in the scientific literature. Just to give you an example, the one, antibody-dependent enhancement, where enhanced virus entry and replication in a number of cell types is enabled by antibodies that you're trying to develop by affecting the immune system, okay? 2, vaccine-associated virus interference, where vaccinated individuals may be at increased risk for other respiratory viruses because they do not receive the non-specific immune associated with natural infection. And he just goes on like this. These are like heavy duty mechanisms proven. He cites all the literature that this happens. Basically, if you get it's crazy. Now, I did a YouTube video back on the 6th of April, 2020, and it was entitled, Why COVID? Back on the 6th of April, I entitled my video. For some reason, it hasn't been taken down from YouTube, because it doesn't have enough views yet, I guess. Why COVID-19 pandemic vaccines are a reckless experiment, back in April.
Wow.
And in that video, which is a 5-minute video, I explained that if you don't allow people to get infected and naturally fight off the infection with the full immune response and the time that it takes while you're resting and recovering from this thing, everything your immune system learns and how your body responds to that infection through the natural process strengthens you for the rest of your life. And you cannot substitute that by circumventing that response to the infection. And the whole idea of vaccines is to circumvent, to short circuit that. Okay, so there's a fundamental problem with vaccination, is that you're taking out of the loop the fact that humans have always interacted with disease, have always had an immune system that co-evolves with the pathogens, and that your body continues to learn about that and to co-evolve and to transmit some of that information to your children when you bear children, that is a natural thing that is the best protection you're ever going to get for the rest of your life. Okay. And instead, we're fragilizing people and circumventing that natural process. And I said that and I explained what all the risks were. Well, now you've always had, I didn't cite all the scientific literature, but you can go into this review article and go and get all this scientific literature. I'll just go down to the last 15 and 16, just to give you more examples. 15, vaccine-associated enhanced respiratory disease, where vaccination enhances respiratory disease. There's like 3 heavy-duty articles demonstrating that phenomenon. 16, chronic immune activation. That means continuous innate immune responses. Your immune system just doesn't turn off. You've done something. Either the person got vaccinated and that this happens and they die, or they don't die, but the next time they're infected by something that interacts with what you did to the immune system goes berserk and attacks everything, every little remnant of something that looks like this in your body. Your organs get attacked, everything, and you die. So that's number 16 in this list. And these are just the things that we kind of know and have given names to. Okay, so this is a complex system here. The human body, you're injecting things into it that you don't know what it is really, and you're figuring out that it has a benefit by hiring scientists to do trials that get paid because they find that it's not dangerous. Okay, you know, that's how they're doing this so-called science. Sue, there are some dangers here. Now, what was your question?
No, keep going. I love this because I've always been one to preach about there's a difference between an injection and ingestion to viruses, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's so important because what people don't recognize is our immune system is essentially a vaccine. It's naturally built to fight viruses. That's how it's built. And if you give it the right resources, it's able to fight them. And what the injection is doing is essentially bypassing your main body's natural defenses, going right into the bloodstream, which is completely against our human nature.
Yeah, and that's what the active ingredient wants to do. There's also adjuvants. Now, adjuvant is one of these magical words. It means anything they want to put in there that supposedly makes the vaccine better, makes it more efficient by some way. These adjuvants are just horrible, toxic cocktails a lot of the times, because what they're trying to do is they have this idea, they're different routes towards immunity, and your immune system has many components, and there's different ways you can do it. So the adjuvant might be geared towards trying to get part of your immune system not to react to this active ingredient, and therefore allow the other parts to react because they think that's going to be better. So you have to shut off some immune system to the thing you're injecting using, toxic substances and various things. These are the adjuvants. In the case of the mRNA vaccine, a big adjuvant is this protein shell. They want to encapsulate and protect it. And the proteins they're using, that class of proteins, generally speaking, is toxic. Okay, your immune system doesn't like that stuff, and it's toxic in the real sense. So there's a whole history of what. Well, I should probably tell the story about what messenger RNA vaccines are and where they came from, and why you need this protein shell and stuff like that. Okay. So here's the thing. What they do, it's a whole new vaccine technology in the sense, whole new, I mean, it's been around for a couple of decades, right? People have been testing these things and on animals and developing them and so on for a couple of decades in the literature, but it's never been broadly applied to the human population, never. This is a first in that sense. Okay, so what they do with these things is they make a strand of RNA that is coded to reproduce a particular entity, molecular entity, could be a protein or whatever, that will be part of the pathogen, or that they believe is part of the pathogen, and that your immune system will respond to. So basically, instead of injecting the thing with, whether it's a dead virus or dead pieces of virus or weakened viruses or something like that, instead of injecting those antigens directly into your body, then what they're hoping is that this messenger RNA will go into some of your cells, and then it's built in such a way that it starts the replication, it ends the replication, and produces this protein, say, that you want to used to trigger the immune system. So they're hoping that it goes into some of your cells. Then once it's in the cytoplasm, it'll start reproducing this protein. Eventually the cell will die or burst or whatever, and that stuff will get out into your metabolism, and then your immune system will recognize it as being a bad thing and will develop immunity to it, okay, by various complex mechanisms. Okay, that's the hope. The problem, and so one of the reasons you want to do this is because when you make this RNA, it's a synthetic process. You're making it in the lab. You don't need a virus. You don't need to culture viruses to develop this thing that you're going to inject. It's all synthetic. So in a sense, it's clean. And it's low risk in terms of manufacturing because it does not involve cell cultures and live viruses and things in the manufacturing process. So there's less chance of contamination. So in principle, they are safer in terms of the manufacturing process than regular vaccines. Also, very important, they're cheaper to make, way cheaper to make, because you don't have to culture cells. You don't have to get live viruses in order to kill them in order to make this thing, okay? You can just make something in the lab, and there you go, okay? Okay, so this ties into why they want these vaccines. This is a case where you don't have a purified, certified samples of the pathogen that you can send out to labs to develop vaccines. It's a case where all you have is a genetic code that is supposedly the genetic code of this particular pathogen that was concocted using indirect methods because they never started with a purified sample of the vaccine, okay? So you have this synthesized genetic code that's published, not even published in the scientific literature originally, not even verified by scientists and the science establishment, but just sent off to the World Health Organization by China in this case. So you have this genetic code, but you don't have the pathogen. So, okay, no problem. We'll find things in the genetic code that we think are something that the immune system should attack, like a protein from the spike thing on this coronavirus. We'll make RNA that can encode that, and if you put it in a cell, reproduces it, and then we'll inject that RNA into the cell. And they'll tell you it's safe because there's no way that messenger RNA can enter the nucleus of your cell. So it's not going to screw with your genetics. It's just going to be in the cytoplasm making this protein. So it's cheap to make. You don't need a purified virus. You can use anything. Anytime anyone concocts a genetic code that's supposedly the thing that's going to kill everybody on the planet, you can go and decide which part of that you want to reproduce and make a vaccine for it. Okay? This is why they're doing this. Okay? It solves a lot of their problems. It's cheap to make. It's relatively safe. You can globalize it because different labs, when you start making it by the dangerous methods and you have different labs, they don't all have the same norms. They don't, there've been terrible catastrophes in Africa because labs were using substandard methods of making these things and so on and so on. You get rid of all that. You can make it cheaply. You can still sell it for a lot of money. And you can be doing this every season. Anytime you can get scientists to say, we have a new one, there's a new strain, there's something new, here's the genetic code. You go into the lab, you make this messenger RNA, and you can start injecting people with it. Okay, so they want this to be a regular thing, and they can't do the proper science because they're not going to bother getting purified and proving that they have an actual new pathogen that's virulent. Okay, and the other reason it works is because the pathogens that they're concerned about, viral respiratory diseases, generally speaking, are not particularly virulent pathogens. Sure, they kill people and it's seasonal, but it's not a virulent pathogen in the sense that, oh, look, this person touched that person who touched that person, and now they're all dead. No, it's nothing like that. Okay, so you cannot measure the beneficial effect of the vaccine because it's too hard to detect, because it's something, they're viral respiratory diseases and those symptoms are around all the time, and they're not huge killers. So you can't tell. It's hard to prove that it's the vaccine that killed the person, except in obvious cases when the next day the person dies. and it's hard to prove whether or not the vaccine has any beneficial effect. If this was a virulent thing, your vaccine would have to work. You'd have to be able to show that the people vaccinated in this town are still all alive, and the next town over, they're all dead. You'd have to be able to demonstrate. If it was virulent, you'd have to. So you remove that. So you can't disprove the garbage that they're telling us about how efficient this vaccine is in terms of reducing risk. You can make it in low risk circumstances at low cost, and you don't even need the pathogen to make it. It's perfect. In this way, they can tax you using public money, the global population, every single season. It's this huge cash cow for big pharma. Huge, huge, huge. It's a way for the global superclass, that elite class, to force us to pay them protection money. That's what this is. It's protection money, protection against viruses. You're going to pay, and you're going to pay through this route. This is how we're going to scam you. Okay, so it's the same kind of scam as the carbon economy. You know, how do you transfer regularly a lot of money to the global elite that controls everything in the Western world? Well, make it into a carbon economy and let them control it. Let them decide how many credits to make, how to trade them, take a cut every time they trade carbon credits and so on. Let them run those institutions and make sure that they're always on top and they're always getting this constant flow of protection money. So you've got protection money against global warming, you've got protection money against viral respiratory infections, and they're always looking for these scams, and they're developing them all the time. So we're in a place in the world where this superclass of global elite are more powerful than most Western countries, and are able to influence, degrade democracy, and using their huge global propaganda instrument, even penetrate Eurasia and large countries that still have sovereignty, like China and Russia, are affected by this propaganda, because the propaganda can be used ultimately to justify going to war, huge wars. So everyone's on edge, and everyone, the geopolitics hasn't gone away. So that's the big picture. I think that's the scam of the messenger RNA vaccines.
And what are some of the dangers that you think could be associated with that? I know you had mentioned it's a lower risk than the other ones, but I do want to emphasize it to the audience. What are
No.
some of the concerns?
Oh, no. Let me explain this. It's only lower risk in terms of the manufacturing process and contamination that can
Okay,
be due to
thanks
the
for
manufacturing
clarifying.
process.
Yes.
It's not lower risk in terms of how much harm it can do to your body and to your family. That all the same risks, and some of those mechanisms that I started outlining, some of them are greater with messenger RNA than with regular vaccines, much greater. Some of them are only some mechanisms only occur for messenger RNA, okay, mechanisms of harm. So they're as potentially as harmful, as lethal even, and if you start injecting them regularly every season, then the dangers associated with that regularly interfering with everybody's immune system is, I think there's an exponential growth there in terms of what you can achieve in terms of danger. Okay, so there's some serious dangers. This is all very insane. We already know what the main factors are that affect whether or not you're going to get very sick from a viral respiratory disease and whether or not you're likely to die from one. We already understand scientifically in a firm way how to, what are the factors that determine that. And it doesn't matter what the particular strain is. Forget what these virologists are telling you. The virologists are wearing virologist glasses, and all they see is a new genetic combination, a new strain, a new mutation. That must be the answer to everything. They think that the mutation of the particular virus determines how deeply it goes into your lung when you're infected, or how transmissible it is, and things like that. It's complete nonsense. to have a virologist's view of these phenomena, in my opinion. Virologists are useful scientists. They can look at the structures of viruses. They can do the ecology of viruses in our bodies. They can do all kinds of things, but their view of disease is twisted. Okay, it's the epidemiologists that you have to look to if you want some common sense and what's really going on. And the factors that determine how dangerous these things are really well known, established for decades by leading research, and they're not subtle points. It's really well established. First is psychological stress that you're subjected to in your life. The individual is subjected to psychological stress. The degree of psychological stress in your life is a huge factor of how sick you're going to get when there are viral respiratory diseases being transmitted in the winter. It's a huge factor, okay? And that's not something you have to do subtle randomized control trials to discover. You see it right away. And Professor Cohen is the leader who established this decades ago. He studied university students, and he actually infected them with various viruses and looked at the responses, and then was able to show that the group that had high psychological stress got very sick, and the group that didn't get sick, even sometimes didn't even catch it. Okay, so that's one of the first factors for healthy people. The second important factor for healthy people, relatively young and healthy people, is social isolation. If you're an individual that's socially isolated, you're much more likely to get very sick from these things and to even catch it. As crazy, it's counterintuitive almost, but that's the other big factor that Professor Cohen identified. And then, of course, he didn't do his experiments on elderly people, but of course, your general health status is really important, because if you're already frail, if you're already combating other ailments, a heart condition, cancer, whatever, then when a virus infects you and starts to propagate within your body, that is very demanding of your metabolic resources. And you only have so many things you can do to protect yourself against disease. And that combined effect will generally kill people that have heart conditions. So when you look at the seasonal increase of all-cause mortality every winter in the mid-latitude countries in the Western world there, it's not just people dying from the viral respiratory disease itself, but the bacteria that cause pneumonia will take advantage of that attack, and they'll also get in there and give you bacterial pneumonia. So they die a lot from bacterial pneumonia, and people with heart conditions die a lot as well in the winter, much more frequently. So it all kind of goes together. So the co-conditions and your degree of health is really important.
And I love that you're talking about that, because I myself, as an herbalist and a health coach, I always try to highlight the importance of preventative measures, because it, of course, like you said, your psychological, where you are at in your mental state is so important. And then obviously there's regular immune boosting ways and being fit. These are all different strategies that have been proven time and time again to actually help the population build their natural resilience to viruses, because obviously we've been encountered with them. The only reason we've come this far is because of the millions of viruses that we've grown to adapt to. And it really just comes down to being able to build resilience through preventative measures. And unfortunately, we live in a society where many people do dismiss that, healthier lifestyle to actually be able to fearlessly deal with the viruses. Because I noticed myself, I had an incident at a grocery store, because I know I've mentioned this before, but I've never worn a mask. So I'm all about the civil disobedience. I've never worn a mask. And I try to be very amicable. But ironically, the one person in the grocery store that actually was the angriest with me was a very obese woman. And I find it ironic, because most people that actually take care of their health, and there's so many different things that you can do, are the ones that are just going to, surf the wave of the virus and say, I'm going to just deal with it. But then the ones that actually don't think about their health are the most petrified, because they realize it just takes that one thing to throw them off the edge, because they don't have a healthy body at all.
Yes. Well, in several large studies, obesity has been identified as being associated with getting very sick from COVID-19, for example. Okay, so it is a factor that's identified in the studies for sure. But I do want to say something about healthy lifestyles. For example, exercise. Exercise, how that works is is complex. We have to distinguish between correlation and cause. So exercise, if you're exercising a minimal amount every day, let's say you're walking at least half an hour versus always sitting just in front of the computer or on the couch, it's been shown, just that half hour of walking has been shown to dramatically improve your health on every front, more than any medication that you can take, more than anything. It's a huge risk reducer, okay? There's some very rigorous scientific articles about that I've reviewed in some of my papers long ago. But so why is that? Well, just the fact of getting your metabolism going and so on improves everything. It improves your ability to manage stress as well. It improves your resilience to the stressors in your life. It does a lot of things like that. So it's all tied together. Um, but let's come back to stress, because the number one thing in health is psychological stress. And I've written a lot about that. I used to write a lot about a lot of things before this COVID nonsense came about. But psychological stress is really the number one thing. Now, it's important to recognize it's not just absolute stress, that you're actually subjected to stressors in your life, like people are prodding you on a regular basis, like an animal in a cage or something. That kind of stress you can get used to if it's regular. But if it's alternative, then it's more stressful, okay? So it's really about, it's largely perceived stress, how you experience the stress that matters. So it's very hard scientifically to gauge that. But the perceived stress that you're living is the number one factor in all health conditions, okay? Tons of papers about that at the highest level. And so what causes that is society. What we have to recognize, what we don't often recognize, is that we live we're social animals who live in a dominance hierarchy. And the stress that people that are low in that dominance hierarchy experience is the stress of dominance, is being put in their place regularly and being made to understand that they have no influence, have no control, they can lose their job tomorrow, they can, they will be put in their place, they can be put in jail anytime if they cross the line, et cetera, et cetera. Dominance hierarchy is the biggest organized source of individual stress. And it makes you unhealthy. It makes you more susceptible to disease, less able to defend yourself, less able to climb that hierarchical sequence. Okay, so it keeps you in your place. So this is how it all holds together. So yes, it's true that there's a correlation between healthy lifestyles, generally speaking, and health. But you have to look at the people practicing healthy lifestyles are also in the upper middle class. So they're not being subjected to the same dominance hierarchy stresses as working class poor and homeless people who are being subjected to horrendous hierarchical stresses all the time. So I tend to believe that a lot of the healthy lifestyle prescriptions are really, I mean, they're healthy, yes, and they make you feel good, and it helps you to have a good image of yourself, to not be subjected to stress and so on. But in terms of the mechanism, I relate it more to stress. I think that's a dominant factor.
I definitely agree. It's definitely a lot of stress because having these, like you said, just a simple walk, it helps you build that resilience, right? So having certain healthier lifestyles, really that just feeds into your mental health, whatever that looks like. Like, do I take a walk every single day? No, but I'll do other measures, or I'll take, my herbs to help with,
Yeah.
supporting my nervous system. It definitely comes down to your ability to balance out the stress and build that resilience to it, because
Yeah,
I totally believe that's what
but
it
Tania,
comes down to.
you are speaking to people within your social class, and you're telling them, if you want a better, healthier life, and you want to be happier, and you want to suffer less from stress and so on, here is the healthy lifestyle advice that I would give you, and it's damn good advice. And it will help them. And it creates that network of people who are looking to be healthy and looking to be supportive of each other also. That's part of it, right? And having social contacts and all of that. So but you're serving your social class, okay?
Right.
And you're being helpful to them, and that's great. But the real people who are suffering health consequences are the people who are at the bottom of this dominance hierarchy and who are being subjected to horrendous things on a daily basis, who can barely survive, who they're also the ones that will escape through various drugs and through
Right.
violence and through all kinds of mechanisms, whatever they can do to self-medicate, because they're being subjected to extreme violence from the dominance hierarchy. They have no control over their lives. There's lots of good scientific studies that show that people who break down at work are people who do not have any control over the work environment. Okay.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
they're made to feel that they don't have any control and so on. And if you feel that you're climbing, if you feel that you have some say, if you feel that you have influence with the boss, you're doing great. You're in good health, and you're doing great at work, and you're happy to be at work. But it's the other people that are at the bottom there that are really suffering. So all of this has to be taken into account when we talk about health, I think.
Right. Right.
And
It's kind of like you said, the lower class, but
these things are way more important than the particular strain of whatever virus that virologists want to tell us about in this
right.
season. All these things are way more important. Like, come on, we are actively practicing a genocidal war in Yemen right now, killing millions of people, children,
Thank you
families,
for that. Yes.
attacking families, mothers, children, absolutely destroying an entire nation. And it's being led by Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United States, that are funding this genocidal war. Why? Because Yemen wants to have sovereignty. Yemen doesn't want to be bossed around by Saudi Arabia. Yemen wants its own politics. It wants to elect its own leaders. It doesn't want these puppets brought in by Saudi Arabia. Well, there you go. That's a crime against the empire, and we're going to crush you by every means. Okay. So there are these massive crimes of war that are operating right now as we speak.
You're right. That are far bigger problems and far bigger pandemics, essentially, that need to be looked at versus what's being portrayed to us right now in the disguise of a virus.
Yep, I think so.
Yeah, I think so too. And I love that you mentioned that. And perhaps that could be a topic that we talk about on one of our sessions, because it's something that I'm also very passionate about, especially when it comes to Palestine and all these things. It's something I can go on about forever. But really, it really comes down to not just taking care of our health and our mental state, but being, mindful of the lower class, unfortunately, people that are completely dismissed and not having their needs met. What is something, if there is something that you can recommend that we can try to do for these, lower class people? I don't like using the word lower class, but people that necessarily need our help to boost them up. What is something that you think that we could try to do to try to make them less susceptible to this?
I'm going to turn the question around. I'm going to say, this is the phrase that lefties often use, but I think it's a very powerful phrase. Fight your own oppression. In other words, whatever class you're in, wherever you're at, fight the people that are removing your freedom. Fight against that loss of freedom, that loss of influence in society, that muzzling of your words and of your actions. Fight against that as efficiently as you can, using the strongest contact points that you have with society and with the system. Fight it. That's the best you can do for everybody, yourself and everybody everywhere in the dominance hierarchy. Okay, because we cannot save people that are lower in the dominance hierarchy. They have to save themselves. They are the ones that somehow, and this has been done historically over and over again, they are the ones that are going to fight back. They're going to find a way. But there are rare allies. You and I can be rare allies to people who suffer more and who are in more precarious situations. But the ally phenomenon is a rare one. And to be a true ally and to be really fighting with them and for them, in a sense, not really for them, but with them, and giving them access to your resources and to your more influence and so on. To be an ally like that is a very rare thing. These are very rare individuals. So you can't depend on that to save the world.
Right.
Each person has to make the contacts they can and fight the way they can with those contacts. And usually it's within the class that you're in.
You're right.
So
Making the connections.
it's the
Yeah.
working class that gave us Brexit. It's the working class that gives us the yellow vest in France. It's largely the upset small business and working class and lower middle class and so on that are the Trump phenomenon, you know,
Yeah.
that are really tired of being told what the ideology is that makes no sense to them and so on.
I
So
love that. And I think that's a wonderful way to almost, you know, start to wrap it up in a sense that it does come down to standing up to oppression and fighting fear, fighting oppression without fear. That's what it comes down to, because regardless of what class you're at, that feeling of being oppressed will feed into your sickness. It will feed into destroying your body one day at a time, because you almost feel helpless. And that feeling of helplessness and letting that oppression happen without any sense of empowerment will destroy you regardless of which class you're in.
oh yeah, it's the number one major determinant of health, of individual health, without a doubt. I think the science is now absolutely clear on this, irrespective of what big pharma wants to tell us, irrespective of what they teach in medical school. High level research science is unambiguous on this point. Okay, period.
Right.
So forget when you hear that this miracle drug is going to save us and they're going to cure cancer and they're going to give us vaccines so no one will ever get a cold anymore. That is complete garbage. Complete garbage.
Yeah. And I love that. Diddy, I have to, of course, ask you if there's anything else that you wanted to add to all the incredible information that you shared today. Everything from PCR to masks to the vaccines to really rising up against that oppression. I love that. Is there anything else that you wanted to share?
I think we covered a lot of ground, Tanya, and the main thing I want to say is I want to thank you for giving me this venue and for the privilege of interacting with you, because we plan these things and we look to the future and try to have the most impact in what we're doing. And it's a privilege. It's a privilege to have people like yourself interview me.
Thank you.
And so thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Denise. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.